Hello and welcome back to yet another episode of What a Week. I'm joined, as always, on the other end, all the way in Dallas, Texas, by my friend Andrew Petiprin. Not really Dallas, the greater Dallas area, the Dallas-Fort Worth metro area, right, Andrew?
That is correct. I'm in one of the many sprawling communities of the DFW, as we say.
And there are many of them, indeed.
There sure are. Yeah.
Well, how are things in Dallas today?
Things are good. We've had some nice, we haven't talked about weather in a while. I think we vowed we weren't going to chit chat about weather, but doggone it, the weather has been pretty nice here, I have to say.
Very nice.
So,
yeah, I mean, from our time in Texas, October, November was pretty grand. Just a great time of year, beautiful weather before it gets, I mean, it doesn't really get cold in Texas ever. Ices a little bit here and there, but it was never like uncomfortably cold. But October, November was really nice. I remember like great weather for trick-or-treating, for example.
Yep.
Yeah, definitely some of the best time of the year, I think, in Texas.
Yeah, it's been great. How about you? You've been traveling.
I have. Did a whirlwind trip to Los Angeles, which was fun. Got to meet a business partner in Brazil, or from Brazil, who was visiting LA, and that was a great time. Saw a friend of mine out there in LA as well. But yeah, a busy trip. It was literally out. I wasn't even there for 24 hours, so it was a 4-hour flight out there on a Monday, and a almost 4-hour flight back on the next day. But yeah, it was good. It's good time. Very busy week though. Things at Hallow are also busy, but glad we can hop on for a conversation about this. We got some important stuff to talk about today.
We do. I'm looking forward to it.
I wanted to tell you, not tell you, but kind of talk to you about this. I have been thinking that one of our future conversations should be about men and boys. There is a Brookings Institution scholar whose name is escaping me. I was just listening to a podcast with him earlier today. And he's written a book on boys and men. There's a project at Brookings called the Boys and Men Project that he heads up. His name is Richard Reeves. There it is. So he has a book called Of Boys and Men. It's published by Brookings Institution Press, and it is all about the crisis of the modern male. And this is these ideas that he talks about in this book. Although I haven't read the book, like I said, I'm listening to this podcast right now in which he explains all about it and the project. But the ideas are very compelling, and I am certainly convinced. I have been for many years, but especially now, ever more convinced that men and boys in America face a serious crisis, Andrew. Yeah. And how we affect that is going to how we try to make a difference in that is going to really, I think, set the tone for a lot of the future of this country. David Brooks even wrote about this in a recent New York Times article. I don't know if you saw the David Brooks piece, but
no, I didn't.
This is not news to people like you and me, but people who have been thinking about this stuff for a long time, and people who are fathers, I think, will not be surprised to hear some of the ideas that Richard Reeves is bandying about, because he's really onto something, and there really is a serious crisis among our men and boys. So I think we should maybe, find some articles, maybe a close read about this crisis, and bookmark it for a future session of What a Week, because there's a lot to talk about here.
That sounds great to me. That reminds me, when I was at the Catholic Literary Imagination Conference a few weeks ago, Abigail Favali was there. I told you about that, who's been on the Creedal podcast as well. And during her panel, where she was talking about women's stuff, a lot of this boys and men's stuff came up in the context of that. So I think it's all of a piece, like, what is a woman? What is a man? How do we grow into our God-givenness as men and as women? Certainly something that I think about, as you said, as a father of a son and a father of a daughter. I'm very interested for both of my children that they grow up in a world that, we acknowledge we're kind of in a bit of a crisis with regard to these things. What are men about and what are women about? And that's too bad.
Yeah, and of course, the ontologically or metaphysically antecedent question is that, what is a woman? What is a man? What makes a man? What makes a woman? What is the telos of a man? What is the telos of a woman? Those questions are all good, important priors, related, in fact, to our close read for today, where he talks about sort of metaphysical disasters. But the more practical outworkings of these is the realities that men are in a crisis. And the crisis is not simply that we don't know what a man is, or that,
right,
young men find themselves not wanting to embrace their sexual identity and instead sort of pursue alternatives. That's part of the problem, but more practically, I mean, we're seeing an absolute collapse in literacy, for example. We're seeing men not want to go to college. We're seeing men drop out of the labor force. We're seeing grown men not get married. We're seeing men not have sex. We're seeing men 36 years old still living with their parents in their parents' basement, obsessed with video games and addicted to heroin and all these things. Like this is the sort of practical outworkings of the crisis of men and boys as we see it today. And it's really tragic. It's happening everywhere. And I don't know what the way back is from it. Now, when I read this Richard Reeves book, I'm going to request a review copy from Brookings. But when I read this book, maybe he has some really good, practical, workable solutions. But I don't see a way out of it from my vantage point, unless we do, to your point earlier, get some of those sort of metaphysical priors corrected so that we can encourage our men and boys to sort of reclaim what they should be and pursue that.
I think we've definitely got a good topic for the future.
Cool. Anything you want to banter about before we head into our misinformation segment?
Well, one small thing. I believe we had a little bit of feedback from our last episode about our interpretation of the Disneyfication question. We were talking about Disney and Pixar in particular, and how they do or do not handle the issue of mourning and grief and loss. And maybe you could remind me of what the comment was that we got.
Sure. Yeah, this was a great piece of feedback from our user or from our listener. So Pat, thanks for writing in. Really appreciate you taking the time. And I'll just read the email in its entirety, if that's okay, or just about in its entirety. Pat says, "Hi, Zach and Andrew. I generally dread getting through your misinformation section and enjoy your deeper dives. I think there's enough opportunities to dunk on the libs in society, and I think you're better than that. I've listened to all of your episodes and have always enjoyed the positive tone. The misinformation segment is an unfortunate departure from that. I don't always agree with your all's takes, but enjoy your deeper discussions. I'll hold off on the COVID conspiracy rants." So that's the first part of this. Let me just respond briefly. First of all, thank you. Love the feedback, Pat. Even if you don't totally agree with me, totally fine. In the misinformation section, I hear you. I also don't want to simply dunk on the libs in society. The misinformation section, as we've designed it, is designed to just be sort of a lighthearted entree into the deeper questions. And it's not really, I think it may sometimes end up feeling like we're sort of dunking on libs, but we're not. I think we, at least we're not trying to intentionally. I think we've picked on both sides in these headlines, and we've also done just sort of silly things like, wind turbines made out of gummy bears. So it's not designed to be a dunking on libs section at all. But I think it does sometimes help to just highlight some of the more idiotic or lunatic-driven aspects of our society and be able to laugh at some of those things, even if they are serious symptoms of a deeper cultural and sociological malaise. But I'm sorry you don't enjoy it. We'll certainly try to avoid having a sort of dunk on libs tone to it and keep it upbeat. But I appreciate your feedback there. And then the COVID conspiracy rants. I don't know. I know you followed that up, Pat, with a winking emoji. I don't know if you're referring to my COVID conspiracy rant. I don't know. I've certainly never endorsed a COVID conspiracy. I do think that COVID came from a lab in Wuhan. That is not a conspiracy theory. That's a theory that's shared by several mainstream journalists and has been written about in mainstream publications like New York Magazine, for example. Josh Rogan of the Washington Post is pretty adamant that's exactly how it happened. I have said I do not think it was an intentional leak. I think that would be sort of in conspiracy territory. We think that the Chinese designed this virus and unleashed it on society, and I don't think that. But I do think it was a leak from the lab born of carelessness, and I think that's where the evidence leads us. So I will certainly stand by that, and I will push back on it being called a conspiracy. I don't think I've ever talked about any other COVID conspiracy. I don't really hold any opinions on COVID that could be attributed to a conspiracy. I think we have, Andrew, maybe talked about the vast profit incentives driving the COVID vaccination campaigns, and I also will stand by my comments on that. I even saw a commercial on TV the other day for the vaccine, and I was expecting this to be a CDC commercial. Andrew, it was a Pfizer commercial. This commercial is brought to you by Pfizer, and It was a go get your COVID-19 shot now. So what I've said previously is not that the COVID vaccines are things that you shouldn't take. I've said that it is silly and foolish to ignore the fact that the manufacturers of the COVID vaccines have a massive profit incentive in making the vaccine seem as attractive as possible. And I still stand by that claim as well. But Pat, would love to hear your feedback if you have another opinion. Andrew, do you have any comments on that first part of Pat's letter? And I think the next part, he has a good corrective for us on the Disneyfication of death.
Well, for my part, all I seek to do with the misinformation is dunk on Hollywood celebrities. So it's not the libs per se, but it is my interest in popular culture that drives my funny tidbits. But today, hopefully, I have ones that are just generally amusing and not particularly disparaging of anybody.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay. The Venn diagram, by the way, of Hollywood celebrities and
I know
leftist folks is
right.
it's basically one circle. That's the Venn
Indeed.
diagram. Okay, so Pat's second comment here, really valuable here, I think, and like I said, it is a good corrective for us because I think we were wrong. I had mentioned previously on our episode about the Scruton line of the sort of Disneyfication of death. I was saying I referenced Pixar and said I don't think Pixar handles death well. It is sort of a Disney-fied take on death. And Pat says, I think you missed two great examples of how Pixar handled death, Up and Finding Nemo. You could argue that both are about the husband-father figure coming to grips with the loss of their wife. Not sure if those were produced before or after being bought by Disney. And then Pat says, from an under 50 Catholic, father of 9, which is awesome, STEM professor at a large state university who loves teaching people to use R. All right. So this Pixar point, yeah, I was wrong. I'll definitely admit that, Pat. I think you're right. Up strikes me as an especially important entry into this genre, showing a man who is wrestling with the death of his wife, who doesn't know how to mourn her, who in fact doesn't really mourn her until a Boy Scout, I forget his name, Russell maybe, helps him do that. Exactly. He teaches the old man how exactly to mourn his wife and helps him process her death by taking her ashes to the magical land and quasi-magical land and sort of depositing them there and saying goodbye. So that, I think, is a perfect example of what Scruton is talking about, this sort of learning how to mourn and by mourning to be sanctified, because this man becomes a better man through the process. He becomes friends with this Russell. He's no longer an old crotchety widower, but a loving sort of grandfather type figure. And I think that's perfect. And the exact opposite of what I was claiming in the last episode. Finding Nemo, I take your point. I think it's still a little bit weak. I don't really think there's much mourning going on or much processing of mourning because the mom dies and that's sort of it. There is the bond between father and son becomes a lot stronger in that, but it's not really through the process of mourning per se, I don't think. But it does handle death in a more sensitive way, I think, than I was giving it credit for. So I still think that's a useful corrective. Those are my comments. But Andrew, what do you think? I know you've seen both films as well.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. I agree with everything you said about Up. I think the opening sequence of Up is one of the very best things that Disney's put on screen in modern times. I remember my wife and I saw it at the movie theater. In fact, I believe she was pregnant with our first child at the time when we were at the movie theater watching the movie. And, the whole thing is a montage of the life that he had with his wife. And then she dies. And it's just devastating. I mean, we were both just kind of moved to tears watching that. I'll just add one thing about the process of mourning for him. You'll remember that in the montage, one of the great sadnesses that he and his wife experienced was that they had a miscarriage, and then weren't able to have children. They had no children, and the entry into his life of this boy who kind of needs this father figure, grandfather figure, helps with, I believe, a kind of closure or a kind of processing the loss of the fact that he had never been a father as well. So I think that Up is a really great movie for thinking about loss and mourning for sure. I'm not so sure about Finding Nemo. A couple of other Pixar movies popped into my mind though too. One of them is Inside Out, which is a movie that I like pretty well. It's not so much about death, but it is about kind of childhood loss in the form of moving, which on the surface of it, it's so interesting for me to feel an affinity with the parents in that movie, having moved my kids a couple of times and that sort of thing. But it's a really beautiful movie, I think, about a young person coming to terms with loss of a certain kind. So I like that one. I think that Wall-E is another one where I don't think that is necessarily so much a film that teaches us about mourning, but it is just a kind of beautiful movie, especially the first half, a kind of beautiful movie about processing cultural loss of the kind maybe that would relate to what Scruton was talking about with Germany. It's sort of about this sort of, picking through the rubble of a civilization, and like, and Wally's a robot, so he doesn't have any kind of like feelings about it, and yet there's something about him that is expressive and makes us feel that there is a lot to lose about the world that we've built. So I would say, on the whole, and maybe we could point to other examples. Toy Story has some elements of that. Soul, I think you mentioned, which I have to correct myself, that my children really did like that movie. I said I thought they were just kind of so-so on it. They really liked it, but I haven't seen it, so I can't weigh in. But yeah, I think on the whole, Pixar handles that stuff reasonably well.
Yeah, so I appreciate it, Pat. Thanks so much for writing in. I appreciate the feedback. Thanks for pointing out that I was wrong. I think again, the example of Up was great, and I think I also don't know, like you, I don't know if Up was before or after the Disney acquisition of Pixar, but I do think that Pixar did something remarkable. Has done it less so, although I think people could argue maybe like Coco, maybe Encanto. I think Encanto has some big fans out there. Pixar has done something different than the sort of average Disney fairy tale type of fare, and they've done it generally well, which is good. Hopefully they continue to do it, but it does seem like they've maybe gone downhill post Disney acquisition. But again, I don't know if Up was before or after, but either way, Up's a great example and a good movie overall. So thanks for writing in, Pat. To anyone else who wants to write in, please do Zac at creedlepodcast.com. We'd love to read the feedback on the show and talk through it. Pat, thanks once again. All right, Andrew, let's do misinformation.
Okay, here we go.
No dunking on libs, though.
No dunking. Well, just maybe a little swish jump shot or something like that. Right. Just a small one.
Sounds
okay,
good.
Number one. Are you ready?
Ready.
Okay, here we go. If true, here's number one from the New York Post. Biden insists U.S. economy is strong as hell as he munches an ice cream cone.
This has to be real. There's
a little context here. President Joe Biden. Well, we'll see. President Joe Biden apparently got brain freeze during a pit stop at an Oregon ice cream parlor over the weekend and forgot about the millions of Americans suffering financially when asked about the economy. Our economy is strong as hell, he said, as he munched on a waffle cone of Baskin-Robbins chocolate chip ice cream. That's number one.
Baskin-Robbins seems kind of like a lowbrow ice cream for the president of the United States, so that's the one thing that gives me pause here. But okay.
Especially in Oregon, right? Seems like it would be like a craft ice cream.
I mean, Oregon, by the way, is the home of the best grocery store ice cream made in America, and that is Tillamook ice cream. If you've not had Tillamook, highly recommend, Andrew. Tillamook ice cream is the best ice cream that is out there. I'm an ice cream connoisseur, so I've self-identified ice cream connoisseur. So I've had a lot of them. Tillamook, head and shoulders above the rest of them as far as quality. All their flavors are delicious. They've got some really good ones. The latest I've been enjoying is Tillamook Mudslide. Highly chocolate. I'm a chocolate purist when it comes to ice cream, and it's delicious. So there's also like a peaches and cream. There's a cherry. There's a like peanut butter variety. There's a cookie dough it'll knock your socks off. So Tillamook ice cream. I don't know. This gives me pause. I was tracking with it. I was thinking this had to be true, Andrew, until you got to the Baskin-Robbins, and that is, I don't know. I'll have to think through that one. What else we got?
I believe I have had that brand, by the way, but you are obviously a superior ice cream consumer than I. But okay, so hold on to that one. Okay. Biden and ice cream. Okay, here's number two. This, if true, is from Yahoo News. Millions mistake the middle name of America's 37th president. A recent poll showed that 1 in 4 Americans over the age of 40 believe the middle name of President Richard M. Nixon was Milhouse, the name of a character on the long-running primetime cartoon show, The Simpsons. Although Nixon's real middle name is Milhausen, millions of Americans express certainty in their false memory of the 37th president's name, representing the phenomenon known as the Mandela Effect, a term derived from the false memory that millions have of the South African activist and future president Nelson Mandela dying in prison in the 1980s. Okay.
This also sounds very believable. I am familiar with the Mandela Effect, so that is true. The question is about the Milhouse versus Milhausen, right? Because I didn't know his middle name, Milhausen.
Yeah,
I always just hear
Richard
Richard M. Nixon.
Milhausen. Yeah.
Okay. So
Okay.
Milhouse is the Simpsons character.
Correct. Yeah.
Milhausen is his actual name. Millions of people think it's Milhouse. False memory that he's named after the Simpsons.
Exactly. Yeah.
Vice versa, probably, but yeah. Okay.
Okay, you good? All right. So that's number 2. Here's number 3. Excuse me. All right. This one is from AP News, if true. The title is, "Are You a Mosquito Magnet?" A new study finds that some people really are mosquito magnets, and it probably has to do with the way they smell. The researchers found that people who are most attractive to mosquitoes produce a lot of certain chemicals on their skin that are tied to smell. And bad news for mosquito magnets, the bloodsuckers stay loyal to their favorites over time. Scientists held a round-robin tournament and ended up with a striking gap. The biggest mosquito magnet was around 100 times more attractive to the mosquitoes than the last place finisher.
Wow.
So
imagine winning that competition and realizing you were one of Earth's most mosquito attractive humans.
Isn't that interesting?
That is very interesting.
All right. So that's number 3, mosquito magnet. You hear sometimes out in the world, people think they're mosquito magnets. This article, if true, says, yeah, they're right. All right. What do you think?
Tough one. I still think, the Baskin-Robbins thing threw me a bit, but I'm still going to come back to this. This sounds quintessentially Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. to me. It is Jr., right? Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. I think it is. I think he's a Biden Jr. It sounds like him. I'm going to guess the first one is true.
You are correct. It's true.
All right.
Yes, he now has quite a reputation for getting these gigantic ice cream cones when he's out and about.
Which by the way, I think is a one of the best decisions he's made. Just get an ice cream whenever you can. I strongly support this policy position of President Biden.
Who doesn't like ice cream? So that's kind of a political winner every time, right?
Yeah.
But it is a little weird when you're munching on a giant ice cream cone, and then you do say that the economy is strong as hell. When of course food prices are up, gas prices.
I would
are
be
up,
curious to know how much he paid for that ice cream. He probably didn't pay for it himself, but I'd be curious to know, if he saw the price tag of that ice cream and then still felt confident. It was probably a $6 ice cream cone.
It probably was.
If he still felt confident saying this economy is strong as hell.
Yeah.
So.
Hey, just a little more context about this, just so you can see what came out of his mouth before he uttered the tagline, "Our economy is strong as hell." He said, "I'm not concerned about the strength of the dollar. I'm concerned about the rest of the world. Does that make sense?" That's what he said. Does that make sense?
It actually doesn't make sense at all.
Yeah. And so then, asked to explain, Biden, 79, replied, "Our economy is strong as hell," and then took a munch off of his ice cream cone.
As one does.
That's the story, and it's true.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's really something. Okay. Well, my advice for the president there is next time you're in Oregon, get Tillamook ice cream rather than Baskin-Robbins, and I will leave my advice there.
All right.
Okay.
So you're left with 2 and 3.
Yeah, 2 and 3. The I don't know, the mosquito thing seems kind of real to me, and the Milhouse thing. The Mandela Effect, definitely real. The Milhouse thing, maybe not real, but I do love it. So I'm going to go mosquito is real, Milhouse, not real.
You are correct, sir. Yes,
right.
It is true that there is such a person as a mosquito magnet. My mother-in-law is always saying that mosquitoes love her because she's sweet and she gets bitten all the time. Well, it turns out she's right.
There you go. My mom was also a mosquito magnet. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. And I think one of my sisters maybe. Yeah, if there are mosquitoes around, they're gonna find you, And I've never really had an issue with that. But my dad tells these stories of him sitting next to my mom, and my mom gets all bitten up, and my dad doesn't get a single thing. It's science. Apparently, it's real.
Apparently so. But
the
you
worst
are
part
correct.
of that though is that they stay with you. Like it's not like if you move to a new locale perhaps or whatever. Like if you're a mosquito magnet, you're stuck.
It does kind of seem like it just has to be your cross to bear if it turns out you're one of these magnets. Alas.
Indeed.
All right, but yes, you were right that number 2, millions mistake the middle name of America's 37th president. That one is false. And I cooked that one up completely because my daughter Amy and I have been talking about the Mandela Effect a lot lately. I
Yeah.
told her about this, and she's now very fascinated with this idea, as I am. The Berenstain Bears, for example,
Yep.
the Monopoly Man having a monocle, all these
Yep.
things I would swear on a stack of Bibles are true. And it turns out, they're not what I remembered. So yeah, it turns out Richard M. Nixon's middle name is Milhouse, not Milhausen. And yeah, so the character on The Simpsons is named presumably after Richard Milhouse Nixon. But I don't know, wouldn't that be
Wait, so it
funny?
is Milhouse. That is his name.
Yeah, his middle name really is Milhouse,
Okay.
not
Yeah. See, I
Milhausen.
didn't even know that. I thought that. Yeah. This shows my ignorance of our president's middle names. But all I've ever heard is Richard M. Nixon. Have not actually heard Milhouse. But that makes
Milhouse.
sense. Makes
Yeah.
sense as to where the Simpsons character comes from.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Mandela Effect is really interesting. It raises all sorts of questions about how our brains construct reality around us. I remember first reading about it probably, I don't know, a year or two ago in an article that described how, Mandela obviously never did die in prison, but so many people think
Right.
he did.
Yeah.
And then I think the Monopoly Man was mentioned in that one as well. And there were some others, but if you search this Mandela Effect examples, you'll see a bunch of them, and you'll
they're
probably
crazy.
find yourself believing half of them until
Yeah.
you're corrected by the record. It's really remarkable.
One of them, Zach, this will keep our streak alive of mentioning Elon Musk in every podcast. One of them is that Elon Musk maybe didn't exist before about the year 2013 or something, which is a theory that I'm willing to entertain. I have to admit. I mean, how is it I never heard of this guy until like a year ago or, whatever, 3 years ago. And now he's like everywhere all the
Yeah.
time.
It
I
is
don't get
true.
it.
It is really remarkable. Yeah, I mean, I think I'd probably heard of him about 10 years ago, but he was a sort of tangential fringe figure associated with, SpaceX, that sort of moonshot company, and maybe Tesla. And now, 90% of the world's population knows who Elon Musk is. Maybe that's a little overstated, but a lot of people know who Elon Musk is. And it's crazy.
Well, do you know, by the way, one of the explanations for why the Mandela effect began, if it's a real thing? It was when they turned on the particle collider machine underneath the city of Geneva, Switzerland. I think it was around 2009, 2010.
Yeah.
And they might have created a black hole, which has created a whole alternate reality that we now inhabit. So
makes sense. Yeah.
I wonder what
I'm on Wikipedia right now.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
I have some examples here. So you already mentioned the Berenstain Bears being Berenstein. The logo of clothing brand Fruit of the Loom featuring a cornucopia. Definitely until this exact moment thought it definitely featured a cornucopia. The existence of a 1990s movie titled Shazam starring comedian Sinbad as a genie.
Yeah.
What else here? Mandela's death. Okay, maybe that's it in the Wikipedia one. But there are, off of Wikipedia, there are a ton of examples, and it's pretty fun.
There are so many.
Go scare yourself.
I wonder what our commentator Pat will think of my I suppose conspiracy theorizing here about the Mandela effect. He teaches in a STEM discipline, so maybe he can explain to us the physics of this.
Indeed, yeah. The CERN particle accelerator opened up a world of false memories. The false memories are just overlaps from various dimensions of the multiverse, right?
I mean,
it's the crossover events or the Mandela, the false memories. Speaking of which, there's an author named Blake Crouch who writes in this sort of genre, sort of speculative sci-fi that has some grounding in real life physics. So he has one book called Dark Matter that sort of delves into the multiverse. He has another book called Recursion, which features an Elon Musk type Titan character, actually, who's doing these kind of like Elon Musk's Neuralink, but this person is trying to figure out ways to preserve consciousness and create sort of digital archives of memories and then recreate those. And then his most recent one is called Upgrade. It's all about genomic sequencing and genomic upgrades. And his stuff stretches the limits of plausibility a little bit, but only a little bit. And they're always really fun thrillers. So check out Blake Crouch's books. It's my free recommendation before the actual recommendation section. But yeah, those were good misinformation ones. Andrew, thanks for bringing those to the table. I liked it.
All right.
Should we move on to our next one?
Let's do it.
Okay. For the close read today, we have a suggestion from Andrew This is a piece by Michael Hanby called "Are We Post-Liberal Yet?" This is published in New Polity, and for those who are not familiar with it, New Polity is an Ohio-based Catholic journal about building a new polity, and it is staffed mostly, or maybe entirely, by Catholic integralists, some of whom identify with the post-liberal movement, maybe even many of whom identify with post-liberalism. But perhaps surprisingly, because of that, this Hanby piece is a critique of post-liberalism, and not too weak of a critique either. I mean, it's a pretty heavy-handed critique where he criticizes some of the underlying presuppositions of the sort of modern strand of integralism, and in particular, this new strand of thought called post-liberalism. And I am definitely prepared to kind of give an overview of this article. It's a long one. I encourage you to read it if you want to. I will link it in the show notes. Hanby has a way with words, but he's also a very well-read scholar, and he drops a lot of references and can write in some fairly opaque prose sometimes. So it is a little bit tough to get through. I took notes as I was going through to make sure I was capturing everything that he was trying to get at. But it's definitely worth your time. So if you are so inclined, I encourage you to click the link in the show notes, open it up, or better yet, subscribe to New Polity so you can get a print copy in your mailbox and sit down in front of a fire, perhaps with a pipe or a whiskey or a glass of wine, and read this article, "Are We Post-Liberal Yet?" by Michael Hanby. Maybe as a prelude to talking about the actual post-liberal piece, Andrew, we should talk about post-liberalism and this sort of emergent post-liberal movement in the U.S. So I had not asked you this beforehand, but are you able to give maybe just a very quick overview of what is post-liberalism and maybe some of its leading lights, Sohrab Ahmari and Adrian Vermeule and to some extent Rod Dreher, et cetera?
Sure. Well, I'm not an expert on all of this, but the first thing I want to say is, Michael Hanby's critique of post-liberalism, the first thing to say is, it's not because he's a liberal. It's a bigger critique in a sense. It's sort of a critique of like almost of everything, really. I mean, this thing is so comprehensive. But yeah, the kind of liberal post-liberal thing. A lot of this in the popular culture has stemmed from the book by Patrick Deneen called "Why Liberalism Failed," in which he argues for a popular audience that there are certain things that are sort of inherent to big L liberalism. We're not talking here about liberal like the Democratic Party liberal. We're talking about kind of, the foundational stuff about American society, Western democracies, that kind of thing. That prioritizes the rights of the individual and a certain conception of freedom, and it goes on and on and on from there. And what Deneen argues is that kind of baked into that from the beginning is a problem that is kind of manifesting itself now. Namely that the whole thing just kind of breaks apart when we turn into ourselves as kind of these individual autonomous units, and we don't have enough kind of cohesive stuff to bind us together anymore in the form of culture. And so, he leads the way along with others, like you mentioned, Sohrab Ahmari, who's a journalist, Rod Dreher, also a journalist, although his take is a little different on some of this stuff than some of these other guys. And people like Adrian Vermeule, who's a legal scholar at Harvard, and Chad Pecknold, who is a theologian at Catholic University of America. And then a lot of other people besides, are saying, okay, well, so we've got this post-liberal reality now. What do we do about it? How do we move forward? Do we kind of contend for power? Do we theorize? Do we sort of try to build new things that are going to kind of allow us to survive the coming onslaught that we're going to be experiencing? So I guess, I would stop there, and a lot of other things that are pertinent to this liberal, post-liberal debate will come out in the Hanby article itself. But the thing that I'll just end with this point, which is there are a lot of people, in fact, I would think the vast majority of people out there in American society who have no idea whatsoever what you're talking about if you say liberal, post-liberal. I mean, this is a debate that is not happening at the popular level at all. So I think that's a significant data point. when we're having this conversation, whether it's about the post-liberal order or integralism, which is the idea that there can be a kind of reunion or resurrection of the idea of a kind of altar and throne kind of based society or something like that. Most people, especially in the United States, they just don't know anything about any of this. But it's important and interesting for a lot of reasons, some of which Michael Hanby is getting at here. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, maybe just I can add a few comments to that, and then we'll talk specifically about the Hanby critique. The self-identified post-liberals, including some of those names that we've already mentioned, they've grabbed that mantle of post-liberalism for themselves, I think, for two reasons. One, in recognition that we are already to some degree or another, in fact, they would say, I think probably to a great degree, we're already in this post-liberal state. And what they mean by that is that America, this republic, was founded on classically liberal principles that every man has a right to life, to liberty, to property. And that government's chief role is, in fact, to secure those principles so that everyone can have a free and flourishing existence, even if that means that existence is going to be basically a sort of atomized existence, or perhaps we could go back to the phaser language of sort of atomized onanism. Their critique of liberalism is that it has exactly done that it has led to this sort of atomized onanism, and that it has also simultaneously just driven us to greater and greater degrees of political polarization, and that it has driven us to greater and greater degrees of absolute godlessness and moral corruption and societal decay. So those guys look at it and say, like in the language of Deneen's book, this is how and why liberalism failed. So they say we're post-liberals. We're post-liberals because we, one, recognize that we are not really living in a liberal society anymore, but two, because we don't actually think that the liberal society is the best way to achieve things. So they say a couple of things. They say basically the law is a teacher, and we should shape laws to teach people how to think and what to think about what is the good. And this is why you sometimes hear the language of common good constitutionalism bandied about by these folks as well. And two, that we actually should not be skeptical of coercion to achieve the goods that we should achieve. Part of the classical liberal conception is that coercion is bad. Or give me liberty or give me death. I will never be coerced if I can avoid it. The post-liberals say, and I mean, today's leftist totalitarians say the same thing. They say, no, coercion's just a necessary tool for us to achieve the type of society that we want to achieve. Right? So the post-liberals say, no, actually, we should use coercion. We should use the power of the law to achieve the type of society that we want to do. What does that look like? Well, it might look like anti-obscenity laws and banning pornography, for example. It might look like banning gay marriage so that we teach people what the function and the institution of marriage is supposed to be about. It might mean that we ban no-fault divorce. There are a whole host of things that we can throw into this conversation about what it looks like to enact a post-liberal society in the way that the sort of Catholic integralist post-liberals want to do. And I'm painting with a broad brush here, and listeners, feel free to send me feedback if I am misrepresenting. I don't want to misrepresent, and I'm not trying to cast aspersions at all. I will say up front, there are a lot of things about the sort of post-liberal integralist camp that I appreciate and that I like. I don't agree wholeheartedly on everything, but I'm closer to their position than that of, for example, a David French, who is aligned with sort of the classically liberal position that the way out of our current problems is to just sort of restore and really again wrestle with these ideas of freedom to pursue life, liberty, and property that we once had, and we need to cherish those again. And if we can only do that and really reclaim a vision of human flourishing and freedom, then we'll be right as rain again. I think that's a sort of tragically misguided for a whole host of reasons. So I'm not trying to cast aspersions on anyone here. I'm trying to sort of paint with a broad brush, but still paint a picture of what the post-liberals are and how they identify. So with that said, Andrew, with our sort of summary there, let's talk about this Hanby piece. And I have some notes here. I'm going to try to give it I'll try to see if I can do this in like 4 minutes. Okay. So this Hanby piece has 4 parts. The first he calls a metaphysical disaster. The second, he says the medium is the message. The third, he says a new version of an old problem, and that's where sort of the heart of his critique is. The fourth, he said, is post-liberalism really post-liberal? And then he has a 5th section, which is maybe sort of more of an epilogue, and it's just called the constellation of philosophy, and that's the most hopeful note in the whole piece. So taking those in turn, in a metaphysical disaster, he talks about how He has this quote. He says, "Political order and political philosophy always presuppose natural philosophy." And he says, I don't mean that in that they're sort of first in understanding and you sort of have to have an a priori conception of those to arrive at the other conclusions. I don't mean that they're first in intention. You should first sort of pursue the intentions of natural philosophy before you can sort of get the right intentions of political order and political philosophy. He says, rather, I mean that they're first in reality, that there is a sort of, there's an ordered structuring of reality that we cannot ignore. And if we do, we end up with this sort of metaphysical disaster that is liberalism. And so he talks about Francis Bacon and Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, and how Francis Bacon actually, more than Hobbes's Leviathan, or more than John Jay and James Madison in the Federalist Papers, he says Bacon is actually more responsible for the American sort of liberal experiment than those other guys, because it's Bacon who sort of combines into this metaphysical soup these notions of potentiality and possibility, and prioritizing those things over actuality. So from Bacon's New Atlantis is born this, we might even call it like an Elon Musk sort of liberalism, Silicon Valley sort of liberalism, Andrew, where the question is not what exists today, but rather sort of what is the possibility for tomorrow? What can we create? And I think from this also comes the technocratic imperative. That simply because we can change something, we should change something. So he says, this has all been the case for a long time. We've been swimming in this metaphysical soup, but three things have changed. One, various events have vindicated the critics of this scheme, and these events are manifold, but they include this sort of shift towards totalitarianism. They include this sort of runaway tech stuff. They include the dangers of some of this tech adventurism, the pursuits of AI I don't think he mentions AI, but I'll throw that in there, the various pursuits of AI that could eventually endanger the human race. He says, two, post-liberalism has reached the pundit class. So it's not at the popular level, like you said, Andrew, but it is, David Brooks is talking about it, and Rod Dreher and all these, Ross Douthat and all these pundits are talking about post-liberalism. And three, finally, perhaps most dangerously, immediately, social media has made us all pundits. We all have a great take, and we're all willing to package this take into 240 characters and sort of make ourselves into pundits. In section 2, he says the medium is the message, and this is where he talks more about post-liberalism. He says post-liberalism has moved to the forefront of the discussion as part of the absolutization of politics, and he says praxis now takes precedence over theory. And he says the danger here is that we have ceased to engage in the world of ideas strictly as ideas that remain theory, but sort of help us get to the bottom of what's happening. And we have prioritized instead schemes that help us sort of just produce facts or integrate facts without an overarching theoretical schema. And so he talks about sort of journalism that is sort of just driven by sort of facts and juxtaposing facts against facts. And I was thinking here of Vox, the Vox, the science-based journalism, or Axios. They really want to be a data savvy, empirically driven journalism. And it's good to be data savvy, and it can be good to be empirically driven and all of these things. But when it is mere juxtaposition of facts without any sort of a priori conception of the common good, there's no real sense of what the telos is. And then we lose any ability to healthily talk about what the telos of our existence is, which is obviously a problem. So he talks about this in the context of social media as well, and he says social media and totalitarianism are made for each other because they sort of obviate the need for any sort of introspective reflection on what we are doing and why we should be doing it, and instead are just simply concerned with immediacy and with effects in achieving the now. Okay, so then he says in the third section, a new version of an old problem. And he talks about this extrinsicism, and he criticizes the integralists who he calls manualists. There's this recent tradition recent by like the last century or so, maybe century and a half, this recent tradition in Catholicism that's the manualist tradition. And the manualists are basically, as I understand it, Andrew, if you have a different understanding, please correct me. But as I understand the manualist tradition, it's heavily Thomistic and really focused on, it's called that because in seminaries, they'd be trained with manuals and you couldn't really deviate from the manual. And the manual basically tells you what is permitted in the Thomistic tradition, within the Catholic tradition, to think and say and do, and how exactly to conceive of yourself. And so Hanby, who I think is a Thomist, basically says the problem with this is that it falls victim to this extrinsicism, where there's no sort of immanence permitted for the principles, in this case of Thomism, to adequately inform our present day. And in fact, you're just sort of keeping them ossified in their 13th century, 14th century shell and just importing them today. But actually, that's not helpful because it doesn't actually give you any real insight into what is happening today. It just sort of keeps you in the 14th century. So he labels that extrinsicism. And he says this is actually a really bad thing because it makes philosophy an exercise in intellectual archaeology and doesn't allow you to be sort of dynamic enough in incorporating old ideas in new ways into what you're doing. And so he says collectively, when you have this problem of either not reflecting on what history has said or just sort of extrinsically importing what history has said to your present moment, the ultimate problem is that you can't actually penetrate and fully apprehend the present moment in which you find yourself. So he says that's the problem. And he says further, this is the problem that the common good constitutionalists, the post-liberals, have created for themselves. They've basically just taken the sort of manualist Thomist tradition and, kind of square peg, round hole, not his analogy, that's mine, have sort of forced it into the present moment and said, this is the answer. This is what we can do. So he says, one of the ways they do this is they talk about the common good and they sort of treat the common good as the solution here. And they said, this is the sort of manualistic solution. The common good is the way that we're going to get out of this crisis of the liberal order. Law is a teacher. We just need to teach people through the law about the common good. And that's the way that we get out of this. And he says, oh, that's true enough that law is a teacher, but to say that, common good constitutionalism is the way out of this mess is to really fail to grasp the depth of the current mess. There's so much going on here. This metaphysical disaster has touched everything we do. And the whole scheme is wrecked from the beginning. It's just rotten from the core. And we can't just slap a common good veneer on top of it and say law is a teacher and be more open to coercion. We actually have to recognize that the whole thing is rotten at its core. And he says, social media and technology have transformed everything about human existence. He says, look, for example, in the past few years, riots have been conjured up around the globe. The sexual orientation, gender identity movement has just, gone from 0 to 60 in about 10 years. And none of this would have happened without the aid of social media that has allowed these things to spread and be instigated like wildfire. And very importantly, he says, this is not a conspiracy theory. It's not like, one of these like cabals are, pulling all the strings behind the scenes like puppets. No, he said it's actually just sort of taken on a life of its own. And it's just a sort of reaction stimulus response that's going on here that allows these things to happen and sort of become a part of the public consciousness without even, just sort of the hive mind. There's no real conscious thought put into it. It's just sort of in the aggregate. And he says further evidence that the whole scheme is wrong. He cites Roe v. Wade and basically says Roe v. Wade fell. That's good. It would have been the right thing even if it never saved a single abortion, although it certainly will do that. But just think about how for 49 years we had Roe v. Wade as the law of the land. And that did so many things. I mean, we talked in the very beginning about just the collapse of men and boys, Andrew. A huge part of that story is on-demand abortion, on-demand contraception. It gives men the freedom to abandon the women with whom they have children because they don't have to stay with the children. It allows men to sever the consequences of sex from the sex itself. And ultimately, it breaks down the family, breaks down the desire of men to actually have relationships because women no longer have the sort of bargaining power over men. So all kinds of things. And he says this is just one example of how exactly liberalism has failed entirely. And to just think you can fix it with common good constitutionalism does not actually fully apprehend how exactly it is wrong. It has been wrong. I'm definitely not hitting my 4-minute target here, Andrew, but just to quickly wrap this up, he says much better, rather than looking at, for example, some of the Summa, he says much better to look at Lumen Gentium and what Lumen Gentium, the document from Vatican II, says about the church and the sacramental nature of the church. And he says we have to do that, or we will lapse into the sort of juridical tendencies of the church of the right or the administrative tendencies of the church of the left. Those perhaps in political terms and sort of terms of praxis reflected in the sort of the post-liberals of the right or the sort of woke totalitarians of the left. And he says both of those are wrong because they're accepting the liberal presuppositions underneath. Even if they say that these things are wrong and they need to be tweaked or they weren't quite based on the right understanding of the human person, they're just wrong entirely. And liberalism is so corrupted at its core that we have to pursue alternatives. So in sum, he basically says that the new post-liberalism doesn't look beyond America. And he cites the name of the recent post-liberal conference. I think it was called like Restoring a Nation. And he says, like, look, Stanley Hauerwas said about Christian ethics in America. He said Christian ethics in America is really about America. And Hanby said in the same way, post-liberalism in America is really about America. It's not actually about post-liberalism. It's not about integralism, really. It's not even about the church, which is really what political imagination should be about. It's about America. And so it's really just, it's repackaging the same old liberal ideas, the same old liberal conceptions, and just saying, how can we save America with these integralist ideas? But he says these two things are just fundamentally incompatible. So in conclusion, his last section, this sort of epilogue, he says the constellation of philosophy. He says the solution is philosophy. And as we've talked about before, and we had Bobby Mixa on to talk about this a little bit, the solution is sort of to re-enchant things, to sort of reestablish a mystique in our political life. He says the truth will set you free is not simply a platitude, but an ontological and a theological principle. And we need to do better at conceptualizing the existence, the reality of human existence, the reality of the human polis, as ordered according to God, as having a telos according to God, not according to the sort of principles of possibility and potential that Francis Bacon would have us believe. So, yeah, definitely not 4 minutes, Andrew, but that's my best attempt at summarizing the piece. So sorry I went way too long.
No, I mean, there's so much in this piece that, and I know we're already running short on time, so we won't be able to delve deep into all of the, all the stuff you just put on the table. But, if I may, I just a couple of like follow-ups to a couple of the things that you put on the table. The first is that, Hanby is following this thinker named Augusto Del Noce, this Italian who died towards the end of the 20th century. Actually, Hanby just wrote a review of Carlo Lancelotti's new translation of Augusto Del Noce's, one of his books in First Things. But Hanby is following Del Noce and sort of saying, look, the problem is not that we're atheists, but that because he would say, atheism is just a kind of bug in the system of Christianity or of theism, but rather that we just sort of are irreligious, that the mystery is gone, the enchantment is gone, as you said before, and this connects to what I took away as kind of the two most striking things about this piece. The first one was that extrinsicism thing that you touched on. Now, kind of in a strictly like Catholic theological framework, I think we can figure some of this out a little bit. So you mentioned like the manualist tradition, right? And yeah, you're exactly right. Like there's a manual, like there's the Summa from Thomas, right? There's like, you need an answer to a question about what to believe or what to think or what to do. You look in the book and that's it, right? In the 20th century, there was a strong pushback against that among the most prominent Catholic theologians. These are theologians that I really like. They're not theologians that I necessarily think everybody in the post-liberal camp really likes. Some of them, yes, some of them, no, but people like Henri de Lubac, Hans Urs von Balthasar, and I think the greatest of them all is Joseph Ratzinger. When Ratzinger, when the Catechism of the Catholic Church was issued in the 1990s, Pope St. John Paul II's great reform, kind of reissuing of the catechism, the new catechism, Ratzinger wrote about what the catechism was. And he said specifically what this is not a manual. This is not something that you're like putting in somebody's hand and saying, that you can just like sort of plunk down and apply like, and it also then relates to the way that we talk, right? Like we don't just say, I believe this because the church teaches it. We say the church teaches this because it's reality. So in a sense, like that's the way the catechism, the Catholic Church is structured. It's descriptive rather than prescriptive. It's meant to describe reality, and very much in opposition to kind of the manualist tradition, right? And meant to capture this sense that like the universe is enchanted and mysterious and like, sacramental. It's a sacramental reality. And I think this is something that Hanby is like worried that the kind of liberal, post-liberal thing, kind of both sides really don't get this part of it quite right. So I'll just name that, and maybe you want to come back to that. I know we're running short on time. But the other thing I really wanted to touch on was also related to the Del Noce stuff is Hanby's insights about technology here. I think that in a sense, my biggest takeaway from the piece is Hanby is saying, look, liberal, post-liberal, at the end of the day, it kind of doesn't matter because we're all slaves to the technology that we have created that now rules us, that has gotten completely out of control. And he says here, commenting on the idea that like the law can shape people, or like, so good laws can then kind of reshape culture or reshape society. Now, a liberal would say the opposite, right? A liberal would say, laws come from the values of a culture, right? So it's kind of like flipped around. And I have a lot of sympathy, like you, to the idea that, yeah, actually, good laws can actually shape people. We should be working for better laws and hope to see better results. So I'm totally down with that. But at the end of the day, I also think I pretty much agree with Hanby in saying the horses are out of the barn here. I mean, it's really tough. In this one part, he says, technology does not wait on politics, and law is largely impotent and permanently reactive in the face of interminable technological revolution and its exigencies. That was a pretty powerful line there. And one more thing I'll say before throwing it back to you is, and here Michael Hanby, who like us, Zach, is a former Anglican, he adapts the opening phrase of the Collect for Purity.
I knew you would include on that. Yeah, that's
I'm
good.
glad you expected that out of me, Zach.
Yep.
But Hanby says here, Almighty Google, to whom all hearts are open, all desires known, and from whom no secrets are hid, is more interior to us than we are to ourselves. And he continues, compared with such awesome new powers, having a few hundred people gather under a dome for part of a year to deliberate policy seems positively antiquated.
Yeah.
It's like, grab the levers of power if you want, guys. But I mean, really, what are you going to do with it? So
no, that's exactly right. I read that out loud to my wife last night. And I was like, Sally, this is actually, I was like, I wonder if Hanby is a former Anglican, because that is straight from the Book of Common Prayer. And Sally was like, I bet Andrew will recognize it too. And I was like, I bet he will. So yeah. No, I'm glad that you clued in on that part. I think that's actually one of the most important takeaways from this, because outside of certain, channels of circles of academia where you're discussing this type of thing on the regular, there's not a whole lot at the popular level in this Hanby piece. And a lot of it, by his own admission, is theoretical. He's not proposing policy solutions. He doesn't say this is exactly how you sort of reform the polis along the lines of Augustine City of God. He mentions Augustine City of God, but this is not a policy position piece. He's not a wonk, right? He's not Ezra Klein, but he's an incisive critic. And I think for most of us, one of the biggest takeaways is exactly that line that you read about Almighty Google. And it's terrifying to think about that. There's all these talks about all this conversation about AI. I mean, Elon Musk says AI has a, non-zero chance of killing us all once it achieves sentience, and et cetera, Skynet, yada. Those are like interesting thought experiments for me. And maybe one day there'll be a lot more than the thought experiment, and maybe Musk is right and we'll all die at the hand of AI. I tend to think that we'll be long dead before that, because we're just going to sort of sleepwalk into Armageddon because of the hive mind, the stimulus response that Hanby talks about here. I may, for one of our future episodes, Andrew, I may sort of prepare a little monologue on the Ukraine crisis, because I think the Ukraine crisis is a great example of this. We have a non-zero chance of nuclear war. The president himself has said we are closer to nuclear Armageddon than at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And we have a situation in which it is just really kind of verboten, according to the hive mind of Twitter, to talk about any ceding any inch of land to Russia, which is obviously the aggressor in this scenario, which is obviously the bad guys, led by Putin, of course, the strongman bully. So it's just interesting to see that the hive mind is already sort of shaping things. I heard a guy named David Sachs on a podcast the other day say it's interesting because we have the president who, and David Sachs is not he's not like a Republican right winger. I think he's kind of a centrist guy, but he's not a radical, and he's not a conspiracy theorist. He's a very prominent Silicon Valley investor. And he says, we have a president who's really making decisions because of what his staff tells him to do. We have a staff that's making decisions because of what the media tells them to do. And we have a media who is doing what the keyboard warriors on Twitter tell them to do. So for the first time, we have literally diplomacy and foreign policy being sort of constructed in the halls of Twitter, which is obviously not the real world, which is subject to this stimulus automatic hive mind reaction that Hanby talks about, which is really, really, really bad. And all of this is enabled by the very same scaffolding that supports the liberal project. Twitter is only a thing because of this whole new Atlantis conception of reality and progress and technocracy that we've created for ourselves. That to me is the scariest takeaway from Hanby. And I think we are sort of sleepwalking toward our own oblivion. Maybe it's not from nuclear Armageddon. It probably isn't, but it's from any number of other things that will happen because we don't know how to make good decisions anymore. We don't know how to run a polity. If we ever did, we certainly don't now. We don't know how to craft good policy. We only know how to sort of react in the moment to 240 character long tweets that are sent by an anonymous, Twitter account that has no clue what they're talking about. But everyone's a pundit now. The pundit class is the entire population of Twitter, and that's how reality happens nowadays. And it's bad. It's not good.
Yeah, I mean, I know we're really short on time now, but I would just say, the one thing that doesn't seem to me like a waste of breath is Hanby's sort of invitation to think about all of these things on a higher level. I mean, to be more philosophically minded. And a couple of the comments I noticed on the piece said things like, this is unreadable, this is just, full of jargon and too difficult. And I think in some respects, Hanby intended that. I mean, I think that's sort of how he writes anyway, but I think he's also trying to say here, like, hey, let's at least give it a go having this discussion on the highest level, the highest register that we can, because that's what it deserves. So, not a lot of practical takeaways, I don't think, from this, except maybe to inspire people to process this stuff on a kind of longer basis, on a deeper basis, and kind of maybe step back a little bit from kind of the journalistic expression of, or the kind of the brand of post-liberalism itself.
Yeah, completely agree. Well, we are just about out of time. Andrew, once again, sorry for the super long summary. I really tried to condense it, and then I just kept talking, and there was just more to go. So apologies. But let's do recommendations. What do you have to recommend to our listeners today?
All right, Zach, I think that I am a big wine guy. I very much enjoy the fruit of the vine, and it's kind of become a hobby of mine to explore wines, especially from France. But I have recently become a fan of a YouTube channel hosted by a German guy named Konstantin Baum, Konstantin with a K and no E, and Baum, Baum. And his channel is called Konstantin Baum, Master of Wine. And that is not just a brand. That is an actual designation in the wine trade. Only about 400 people on the planet Earth have it. So Konstantin is one of the greatest wine experts in the world, and he has a super entertaining wine channel where he compares wines, he tastes old wines, he makes videos about certain regions. He's even recently made one about what the wine might have been like that Jesus served or drank or blessed, etc., at the Last Supper. So great channel if you're looking for something on YouTube.
Very cool. 400 people, Master of Wine. So this is like the highest level of sommelier, basically.
Highest level. You have to pass a super difficult blind taste test in order to get this designation. Yeah, and he's one of the youngest people ever to pass the test, actually.
I love it. Well, I will tell you what. I'll pair something with that. I don't know if you've seen this film, Andrew, and if you have, maybe you don't like it as much as I did. But a film about becoming a wine sommelier is called Uncorked. It's a Netflix film. Have you seen this, Andrew?
Yeah, it's good. Okay.
I was a big fan. I mean, this isn't it's not a Hall of Fame, maybe not an Academy Award winner, but I thought it was a good story with a rather surprising ending, but in a good way. I thought it was in general well acted. I thought the screenplay was well done. And it was good. It was good, but it's about a young man who desires to become a sommelier. And there are some other twists and turns along the way. And his whole family, his young black man, his whole family runs a barbecue restaurant. And so that's been the expectation for him his whole life. But he really loves wine and wants to be a sommelier. So it's sort of the story of their family working through that and of him trying to make it happen. And it's good. So I encourage you to go watch Uncorked. It was a fun yarn, and I thought it was well done. Didn't quite get the reviews that I think it should have. I'm looking at Rotten Tomatoes. It had a 92% tomato meter score, 64% audience, which is pretty low on the audience side. I liked it a lot more than 64%. But all right, so that's my recommendation. All right, anything else, Andrew?
That's it for me.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks so much for listening to another episode. Thanks once again to Pat for his listener feedback. If you have a note you want to send us, it's EAC@creedlepodcast.com. And until next time, God bless you.